January 17, 1945. Stalag 9B prisoner camp, Bad Orb, Germany. A transport arrived carrying American prisoners captured during the Battle of the Bulge. German guards processed the new arrivals according to standard protocol. The prisoners formed lines in the assembly yard. Guards issued orders for intake inspection. One guard approached a group of black soldiers and spoke in German. He directed them toward the segregated barracks section. He expected incomprehension. He expected to repeat himself in broken English. A soldier from the front rank responded in German. The response was fluent. The accent was absent. The guard stopped. He looked at the soldier. He looked at the other prisoners. He repeated his order, speaking faster, using more complex phrasing. 3 more soldiers responded appropriately. They spoke in clear German. They used proper grammar. They understood idiomatic expressions. The guard summoned his sergeant. The sergeant approached and asked questions in rapid German. He asked about their unit, their capture location, their commanding officers. The soldiers answered each question correctly. They used military terminology. They demonstrated comprehension beyond basic phrases. The sergeant called for the duty officer. Within minutes, camp administrative personnel arrived at the assembly yard. They stood observing the black prisoners who spoke the language of their captors. An officer gave a complex multi-step instruction in German. The prisoners began following the order before any translation occurred. They moved to the correct positions. They organized themselves according to specifications that had been given only in German. The camp administrator was summoned. He conducted an immediate interrogation. He asked each soldier how long they had spoken German. Most had learned as children. Some spoke it before they spoke English. They came from Milwaukee, from St. Louis, from Cincinnati, from German-American communities across the Midwest. The administrator realized the security implication immediately. 3 months of similar transports had processed through this camp. 3 months of conversations conducted in German around prisoners assumed not to understand. 3 months of operational discussions, strategic planning, administrative coordination, all potentially compromised. He ordered the soldiers confined to separate quarters. He instructed guards to cease all German conversations in prisoner areas. He began reviewing what had been said in the presence of previous transports. The camp operated on the assumption of linguistic superiority. That assumption had just collapsed. The prisoners had heard everything. They had understood everything. They had remained silent about understanding everything. What happened next would expose contradictions in both Nazi racial ideology and American military segregation policy. It would create a space where language became survival tool, intelligence asset, and moral burden simultaneously. Stories that challenge foundational assumptions about capability deserve attention. If you value accounts that reveal what institutions preferred not to see, stay with Battlefront Insider. Subscribe and turn on notifications. The United States Army remained segregated throughout World War II. Executive orders had been issued. Integration rhetoric existed in policy documents. Implementation was minimal. Black soldiers served in separate units under predominantly white officers. They were assigned primarily to service roles, supply operations, and logistics support. Combat positions were restricted. Command positions were nearly impossible. The military hierarchy reflected civilian racial structures transported to military context. This segregation was policy, not accident. By December 1944, the German offensive in the Ardennes created unprecedented manpower crisis. The Battle of the Bulge consumed American forces faster than replacements could arrive. Units were under strength. Lines were collapsing. Strategic positions were being lost. Military command made emergency decision. Black soldiers from service units would be reassigned to frontline combat. Men who had been driving trucks and managing supply depots were given rifles and sent to fill gaps in infantry lines. The assignment was temporary, expedient, and desperate. Many of these soldiers came from specific geographic regions. Milwaukee had large German-American population. St. Louis maintained German-speaking neighborhoods. Cincinnati contained communities where German was spoken in homes, churches, and businesses. Similar concentrations existed throughout the Midwest and Northeast. These communities had existed for generations. German immigration to America had peaked in the 19th century. By the 1940s, third and fourth generation families maintained linguistic traditions. Children learned German from grandparents. Churches conducted services in German. Social organizations preserved cultural practices. Black families in these regions participated in German-speaking community life. They attended German-language churches. They worked in businesses where German was commercial language. Their children grew up bilingual. For some, German was their first language. English was learned later for school and broader American society. This linguistic capability was never formally assessed by military induction processes. When black soldiers enlisted or were drafted, they were processed through segregated channels. Classification focused on race, not capability. Language skills were assumed to correlate with education level and officer status. Black enlisted men were not evaluated for linguistic expertise. The assumption was systematic. Military intelligence recruited German speakers from universities, from officer candidate programs, from populations expected to possess such skills. The possibility that black enlisted men might speak fluent German was not considered. The classification system had no mechanism to identify it. When these soldiers were captured during the Battle of the Bulge, they entered German POW system. Their military records contained basic information: rank, unit, capture location. Nothing indicated language capability. German command processed them according to standard protocols and racial assumptions. Nazi ideology was explicit about racial hierarchy. Black soldiers were considered inferior by definition. German guards were trained to view them as least capable prisoners. Security measures were calibrated accordingly. The possibility that black prisoners might understand German was ideologically impossible. German guards spoke freely around black prisoners. Conversations occurred without caution. Operational details were discussed openly. Administrative coordination happened in their presence. The assumption of incomprehension was complete. American command structure added another layer. Segregated POW conditions meant black prisoners received minimal attention from senior American officers in camps. Their welfare was lower priority. Their concerns were documented less thoroughly. The assumption was that they required less sophisticated management. Both systems, American and German, operated on assumptions about capability correlated with race. Both assumed black soldiers lacked education, sophistication, and linguistic ability. Both organized their procedures around these assumptions. The soldiers who arrived at Stalag 9B in January 1945 existed at intersection of these assumptions. They possessed capability that contradicted both American segregation policy and Nazi racial ideology. They understood both English and German. They could hear what guards said. They could comprehend what American officers discussed. They occupied unique position that neither system had anticipated or prepared for. The question was not whether they possessed this capability. They clearly did. The question was what they would do with it and when they would reveal it. The camp operated on foundation of linguistic separation. Security protocols assumed prisoners could not understand German conversations. Guards discussed shift schedules, patrol patterns, and security weak points while standing among prisoners. Administrative staff coordinated operations in hallways where prisoners performed work details. Officers planned inspections and disciplinary actions within earshot of those who would be affected. This openness was not carelessness. It was systematic practice based on assumed incomprehension. German was the language of authority and administration. English was the language of prisoners and their management. The separation was presumed absolute. The bilingual prisoners recognized their advantage immediately. They listened to guard conversations about food delivery schedules. They heard discussions about which sections of camp had weakest security. They understood arguments between guards about duty assignments and personal conflicts. Every conversation provided information that other prisoners could not access. Camp records classified these soldiers as service unit personnel. Their files indicated no intelligence value. German command saw no reason to treat them as sophisticated threats. Standard interrogation procedures for officers were not applied. Enhanced security measures for intelligence personnel were not implemented. They were processed as low-priority captures from non-combat roles. The bilingual prisoners maintained apparent incomprehension. When guards spoke German, they showed no reaction. When orders were given, they waited for translation like other prisoners. They performed their assigned duties without indicating they understood the instructions before translation occurred. The deception was consistent and complete. Guards grew increasingly comfortable speaking around them. Conversations became more detailed and less cautious. One guard complained about reduced rations for German personnel. Another discussed his fear about Soviet advance from the east. A third mentioned that his family in Dresden had stopped sending letters. These conversations occurred in immediate presence of prisoners who understood every word. Administrative discussions provided operational intelligence. Prisoners heard when Red Cross inspections were scheduled. They learned which days food shipments typically arrived. They understood which German officers advocated for better POW treatment and which opposed it. They recognized patterns in camp operations that other prisoners could not perceive. Security began experiencing unexplained problems. Contraband appeared in barracks that had been thoroughly searched. Prisoners seemed to anticipate inspection timing. Communication occurred between separated sections despite surveillance. Work details were organized more efficiently than guards expected. Small acts of resistance happened with suspicious coordination. German officers attributed these problems to guard incompetence. They increased surveillance. They implemented additional searches. They separated prisoners into smaller groups. They rotated guard assignments to prevent prisoner familiarity with specific personnel. None of these measures addressed the actual problem because the actual problem was invisible to them. The bilingual prisoner's advantage expanded as German caution decreased. Guards discussed Eastern Front casualties with increasing openness. They mentioned retreats, defeats, and demoralization. They expressed doubt about German victory. They shared information about civilian bombing casualties and infrastructure destruction. All of this intelligence was absorbed by prisoners who maintained perfect appearance of incomprehension. Camp commander requested additional security personnel from regional command. His reports documented discipline problems and organizational challenges among prisoners. He described unexplained coordination and suspicious awareness of camp procedures. His analysis focused on leadership among prisoners, on covert communication methods, on possible security breaches through guard corruption. He never considered that prisoners might understand German conversations. The possibility was ideologically impossible. Black soldiers from service units could not possess such capability. His investigation examined every explanation except the correct one. Senior German officers visited the camp to inspect conditions and assess security measures. They stood in assembly yards conducting reviews. They discussed POW treatment policies. They debated whether current protocols adequately balanced Geneva Convention requirements with military necessity. They evaluated whether camp resources were being allocated efficiently. These discussions occurred in presence of bilingual prisoners assigned to work details. The prisoners heard every word. They understood debates about reducing rations to stretch limited German supplies. They comprehended arguments about whether to maintain current treatment standards as war situation deteriorated. They listened to officers discussing what would happen if camp needed to be evacuated ahead of advancing Allied forces. The information included operational details that should have been strictly secured. Officers mentioned that Soviet forces were advancing faster than expected. They discussed contingency plans for prisoner evacuation or disposal. They debated whether to maintain camp at current location or relocate prisoners westward. They expressed concern about being captured by Soviets versus surrendering to Americans. Every piece of information was filed away by prisoners who asked no questions and showed no reaction. The intelligence accumulated daily. The prisoners understood German military situation better than most German civilians. They knew morale among guards was collapsing. They recognized that officers had lost confidence in victory. They saw that camp administration was preparing for eventual Allied arrival. German frustration grew as problems persisted. More searches were conducted. More restrictions were implemented. Guard rotations became more frequent. Interrogations became more aggressive. None of it worked because none of it addressed the real vulnerability. The camp operated on assumption of German linguistic superiority. Guards believed their language provided inherent security. Officers trusted that complex discussions could occur openly because prisoners lacked comprehension. Administration planned operations assuming that German conversations were functionally invisible to those they controlled. The bilingual prisoners exploited this assumption systematically. They organized among themselves using English. They shared intelligence about guard behavior, about camp operations, about German military situation. They coordinated responses to German orders with information other prisoners could not access. They navigated camp systems with advantage that remained completely hidden. The problem was not that prisoners understood German. The problem was that German command could not imagine prisoners understanding German. Their ideology made the possibility invisible. Their security protocols were designed around assumption that proved false. Their entire camp operation was compromised by blindness that their own beliefs created. The situation was unsustainable. The prisoners possessed intelligence that grew more valuable as German military situation deteriorated. The guards continued speaking freely, unaware their conversations were understood. The security failure expanded daily while German commands searched for explanations that confirmed their assumptions rather than challenged them. Winter conditions in German POW camps deteriorated as Allied bombing disrupted supply networks. Food became scarce. Medical supplies ran low. Fuel for heating was diverted to military use. The Geneva Convention specified minimum standards for prisoner treatment, but German capacity to meet those standards collapsed under wartime pressure. Black POWs received the worst conditions within an already failing system. They were housed in barracks with inadequate insulation. Their food rations were smaller than those provided to white American prisoners. Medical attention was minimal and often delayed. German guards treated them as lowest priority for all resources. American command structure in the camp reinforced rather than challenged this treatment. Senior American officers were white. Many came from regions where segregation was standard practice. Some explicitly requested that black soldiers be kept separate to maintain what they called discipline. Others simply prioritized white prisoners when negotiating with German administration for better conditions. The bilingual prisoners heard these negotiations in German. They understood when American officers accepted reduced rations for black sections in exchange for better conditions elsewhere. They listened to discussions where their welfare was explicitly traded for improvements that benefited white prisoners. The conversations occurred in offices in administrative areas, during formal meetings between American and German command. German guards discussed the differential treatment openly. One mentioned that food allocated to black prisoners could be reduced further without significant complaint. Another noted that medical resources were wasted on prisoners who would likely not survive regardless of treatment. A third suggested that harder labor assignments should go to black prisoners since their loss would matter less strategically. These conversations happened in presence of prisoners who understood every word. The guards assumed incomprehension. They spoke casually about survival calculations and resource allocation decisions. They debated whether certain prisoners were worth the cost of feeding through the winter. Men began dying. A soldier from Milwaukee who had learned German from his grandmother died of pneumonia in February. He had been denied medicine that was available. Guards had discussed in his presence whether treating his respiratory infection was justified given limited supplies. They decided his strategic value did not warrant the expense. He died 3 days later. Another prisoner from St. Louis succumbed to dysentery. He had worked in his family's business where German was the commercial language. He had understood guards discussing whether to allocate clean water to black barracks or preserve it for German personnel. The decision was made in German. He understood it perfectly. He died knowing the choice had been deliberate rather than circumstantial. The linguistic capability that provided intelligence advantage also created unbearable knowledge. The prisoners heard their own dehumanization explained in explicit terms. They understood that suffering was policy rather than accident. They recognized that decisions about their lives were being made based on calculations they could follow in real time. Guards discussed which prisoners looked weakest and therefore most likely to die. They placed informal bets on survival rates. They debated whether certain individuals would last another week. These conversations occurred during roll calls, during work details, during routine camp operations. The prisoners being discussed heard and understood every assessment. German medical staff spoke openly about treatment protocols. Black prisoners received minimal intervention. Serious conditions were often left untreated. The rationale was stated clearly in German conversations. Resources were limited, priorities had to be established. Some prisoners had more strategic value than others. One prisoner from Cincinnati had learned German in church services conducted in his neighborhood. He heard medical officers debating whether his infected wound warranted antibiotics. They decided against treatment. The infection worsened. He survived but lost function in his left hand. He had understood the entire discussion about why treating him was considered wasteful. Administrative discussions about death notification procedures occurred in camp offices where bilingual prisoners performed work details. They heard German clerks processing paperwork for deceased prisoners. They understood conversations about whether certain deaths needed detailed documentation or could be recorded with minimal information. They recognized that their deaths would receive less administrative attention than deaths of white prisoners. The burden of understanding extended beyond their own treatment. They heard broader discussions about POW policy. German officers debated whether Geneva Convention protections fully applied to black soldiers. Some argued that racial status modified international law obligations. These debates happened in hallways, in meeting rooms, in administrative contexts where prisoners were present but presumed not to comprehend. American officers sometimes participated in these discussions through translators. The bilingual prisoners understood both sides of negotiations. They heard American command accepting differential treatment as necessary accommodation to German racial attitudes. They listened to arguments where their inferior status was stipulated rather than contested. The knowledge created isolation. They could not share what they understood without revealing their linguistic capability. They bore witness to their own systematic dehumanization without ability to protest or expose it. Each conversation added weight to burden they carried in silence. By late February, mortality rates among black POWs significantly exceeded rates among white prisoners. Camp records documented the disparity but attributed it to various factors unrelated to differential treatment. German reports suggested that black soldiers had less physical resilience. American reports mentioned different backgrounds and constitutions. The bilingual prisoners heard these explanations developed in German administrative meetings. They understood that official narratives were being constructed to obscure deliberate policy. They recognized that their deaths would be explained through frameworks that avoided acknowledging systematic discrimination. Some prisoners debated among themselves whether to reveal their linguistic capability. They argued in whispered English during night hours. Some insisted that the intelligence advantage was necessary for survival. Others countered that survival without resistance to observable atrocity was morally untenable. One argued that German fluency was their only power in powerless situation. Another responded that power used only for self-preservation while others suffered was not power but complicity. The debate had no clear resolution. Each day brought new conversations overheard, new injustices understood, new calculations about silence versus exposure. Letters written by prisoners were censored by German-speaking staff. The bilingual prisoners understood exactly what would be removed before they wrote. They developed careful language in English that conveyed information while avoiding phrases that German censors would flag. Family correspondence became exercise in strategic communication designed around understanding of how it would be reviewed. Some letters never left the camp. Guards discussed destroying mail from prisoners who complained too explicitly about conditions. The bilingual prisoners heard these discussions. They understood that their families might never receive their correspondence. They knew German decisions about which messages would be permitted and which would be suppressed. These preserved accounts exist because survivors chose documentation over comfortable silence. If you value testimony that reveals systematic rather than incidental injustice, these records matter to preserve. By March, the accumulated cost was both physical and psychological. Men had died from treatable conditions. Others survived with permanent damage from delayed or denied treatment. All carried knowledge of what had been said about them, around them, in language the speakers assumed was private. The understanding that should have been advantage had become a particular form of trauma. The prisoners faced not only hardship but comprehension of that hardship's source. They endured not only suffering but explicit knowledge that suffering was deliberate policy. They experienced not only discrimination but detailed understanding of how that discrimination was justified and implemented by those who controlled their lives. The question of whether to maintain silence or reveal their capability took on new urgency. Information they possessed could potentially save lives. Continued concealment protected their advantage but implicated them in a system they fully understood. The moral calculation became more pressing as conditions deteriorated and German conversations about camp's future became more urgent and more dire. March brought shifts in camp atmosphere that the bilingual prisoners understood before others. German guards spoke with increasing nervousness about Soviet advance. Conversations revealed that Eastern forces were moving faster than German command had anticipated. Guards discussed distances, timelines, and the implications of being captured by Soviets versus surrendering to Americans. The camp population had grown with new prisoners from various fronts. White American soldiers arrived in deteriorating physical condition. Many were wounded. Most suffered from malnutrition and exposure. German resources to care for them were nearly exhausted. The camp administration struggled to manage expanding prisoner population with collapsing supply infrastructure. German discussions about evacuation became more frequent and more detailed. The bilingual prisoners heard officers planning routes for forced march if camp needed to relocate. They understood that plans were being developed not to preserve prisoners but to move them away from Soviet advance while maintaining them as potential negotiating assets with approaching American forces. One conversation revealed specific march route covering 200 kilometers through areas with minimal infrastructure. Guards discussed the plan with frank assessment of expected casualties. Officers estimated that 30 to 40% of prisoners would not survive the march. Medical staff were instructed to prepare for deaths from exposure, exhaustion, and inadequate provisions along the route. The bilingual prisoners understood these were not contingency discussions but active planning. They heard specific timelines. They learned that March would begin when Soviet forces reached predetermined distance from camp. They recognized that distance was shrinking daily based on German military updates discussed among officers. The moral calculation they faced intensified. They possessed information that could potentially prevent catastrophic loss of life. Revealing what they knew meant exposing their linguistic capability and eliminating intelligence advantage that had helped them survive. Maintaining silence meant allowing plans to proceed that they fully understood would result in mass casualties. White American prisoners, including ranking officers, had no access to this information. German announcements provided minimal details about potential evacuation. American command in camp operated with incomplete understanding of German intentions. The bilingual prisoners alone understood the full scope and lethal design of planned forced march. Debates among the prisoners occurred in whispered English during limited private moments. Some argued that revealing their capability now would accomplish nothing. German plans would proceed regardless. Exposure would cost them their advantage without changing outcomes. Survival required preserving any edge available. Others countered that information possessed but not used to prevent knowable harm was indistinguishable from complicity. They had witnessed months of discrimination. They had heard their own dehumanization discussed openly. They had seen friends die while understanding that deaths were policy rather than circumstance. Remaining silent about mass casualty plan crossed line from strategic concealment to moral failure. A soldier from Milwaukee argued that linguistic advantage was literally keeping them alive. German guards spoke more freely around them than around white prisoners. This provided warning about dangers, about searches, about punishments being planned. Revealing themselves eliminated protection they desperately needed. His argument was pragmatic. Survival first, justice later if at all. Another from St. Louis argued that survival purchased through witnessing preventable deaths without action was survival he could not accept. They had heard guards discuss the forced march in explicit terms. They understood the route was designed to maximize attrition while maintaining plausible deniability about intentional killing. Allowing it to proceed with foreknowledge made them witnesses who chose silence. A corporal from Cincinnati proposed middle approach. Rather than announce their linguistic capability directly, they could act on information without explaining how they obtained it. They could position themselves strategically during evacuation. They could guide responses to German orders. They could use their understanding to coordinate resistance without revealing its source. Others questioned whether this approach was viable. Any sophisticated response to German plans would itself suggest intelligence source. American officers would demand explanations. German command would investigate how prisoners anticipated their moves. Partial revelation risked same consequences as full disclosure without same potential benefits. The group debated whether their claims would even be believed. Both German guards and American officers operated under racial assumptions about capability. Black soldiers claiming fluent German might be dismissed as impossible or viewed suspiciously as evidence of collaboration. Historical cases existed where prisoners who revealed unexpected capabilities faced investigation rather than utilization. The moral weight increased as specific dangers materialized. They overheard German medical staff being instructed to prepare for mass casualties. They heard logistics personnel discussing minimal food allocation for the march. They understood conversations about which prisoners would be left behind if they could not maintain pace. The planning was detailed, the timeline was specific, and the lethal intent was explicit. One prisoner had heard argument between camp commander and regional authority. The commander advocated for surrendering camp to approaching American forces. Regional command insisted on forced march to maintain prisoners as assets for negotiation. The camp commander had expressed doubt about prisoner survival during such march. Regional command responded that survival rates were secondary to maintaining control until formal surrender could be negotiated. The bilingual prisoners recognized they faced decision that would define how they understood themselves after the war. They could maintain protective silence and survive with knowledge that they had allowed preventable deaths through inaction. Or they could reveal their capability, lose their advantage, risk retaliation, and attempt to prevent catastrophe without guarantee of success. Some wanted to warn specific white soldiers who had shown basic decency toward them despite prevailing segregation. They argued that selective warning might be possible without full exposure. Others countered that any warning would lead to questions about information source. German security would investigate. American command would demand explanations. Partial revelation offered worst of both outcomes. Exposure without strategic benefit. The prisoners evaluated which American officers might be trustworthy with the information. Many had demonstrated indifference to black prisoners' welfare. Some had actively participated in discriminatory treatment. A few had shown basic fairness within constrained circumstances. Identifying who might act on intelligence without either dismissing it or exposing the source required careful assessment. They discussed timing. Revealing too early gave German command time to adjust plans while minimizing prisoners' ability to influence outcomes. Revealing too late left insufficient time to prevent forced march. They needed moment where information could be acted upon by those with authority to change course. The debate returned repeatedly to fundamental question. What was their obligation to those who had shown them minimal solidarity? American military had segregated them. White officers had often reinforced their mistreatment. German captors had systematically dehumanized them. Yet the forced march would kill indiscriminately. Information they possessed could save lives across all racial categories. One prisoner argued that obligation was not to institutions or to those who had failed them, but to fundamental principle that preventable death should be prevented when possible. Another responded that principles were luxuries for those not fighting daily for survival. A third suggested that principles mattered most precisely when circumstances made them costly to uphold. The weight accumulated not from single dramatic moment but from repetition of overheard conversations, from detailed understanding of German intentions, from recognition that time for decision was narrowing. They possessed knowledge that others lacked. That knowledge created responsibility they had not sought and could not easily escape. The choice crystallized not through consensus but through recognition that continued silence had transformed from strategy into something else. The camp commander's private doubts about forced march, overheard in German, revealed that even German authority recognized the plan's lethal nature. Regional command's insistence despite those doubts clarified that casualties were acceptable cost rather than unfortunate possibility. The bilingual prisoners understood in explicit detail what was being planned, why it was being planned, what outcomes were expected, and that those outcomes included their own probable deaths along with hundreds of others. The choice was no longer between strategic silence and risky revelation. It was between active prevention and passive complicity. The decision emerged through accumulation rather than declaration. Silence had served survival for months. Continued silence served something else. The transformation was gradual, then suddenly complete. The question was not whether to reveal but how to reveal in manner that maximized impact while minimizing retaliation. The decision reached among bilingual prisoners was methodical rather than dramatic. They would not announce their capability through direct statement. Instead, they would demonstrate understanding through action that made concealment impossible to maintain. The revelation would be controlled, deliberate, and undeniable. Implementation began during morning assembly on March 15. German Guard issued standard order in German for prisoners to organize by barracks assignment. The order had not yet been translated into English. Before translation occurred, the bilingual prisoners had already moved into correct formation. They positioned themselves precisely according to instructions that officially they should not have understood. The guard noticed immediate compliance but said nothing. The moment was ambiguous enough to attribute to coincidence or routine familiarity with assembly procedures. The prisoners understood this. First demonstration needed to be observable but not conclusive. Second action occurred during work detail assignment later that morning. German officer gave instructions about tool distribution and work site organization. He spoke only in German. The bilingual prisoners moved directly to correct storage area and began preparing specified equipment. Other prisoners waited for English translation that had not yet occurred. German sergeant observing the work detail paused. He watched the prisoners who had responded before translation. He made no comment but his attention indicated recognition that something unexpected had happened. The prisoners maintained appearance of routine compliance while ensuring their understanding was becoming visible. Pattern continued deliberately over 3 days. Each instance involved following German orders before English translation was provided. Each demonstration was slightly more obvious than the previous. German guards began noticing the pattern. Conversations occurred among German personnel about whether certain prisoners might understand basic German commands. On the third day, German officer decided to test the pattern directly. He gave complex multi-step instruction in German. He then provided false English translation with different instructions. The bilingual prisoners followed the German instructions precisely. They ignored the English translation completely. The test confirmed what guards had begun to suspect. Camp administrator was immediately summoned. He arrived at the assembly yard and observed the prisoners who had demonstrated unexpected linguistic comprehension. He conducted impromptu tests of his own, speaking rapid German with complex grammar and idiomatic expressions. All bilingual prisoners in the group responded appropriately to each instruction. Their compliance was precise and immediate. The administrator recognized he was witnessing not basic command comprehension but fluent understanding. He ordered the prisoners assembled for direct questioning. He asked in German how long they had understood the language. One soldier from Milwaukee responded in fluent German that they had understood since arrival. His accent was minimal. His grammar was correct. His vocabulary was sophisticated. The administrator's reaction combined confusion with recognition of security failure. His racial ideology insisted this capability should not exist among black prisoners from service units. The evidence before him contradicted assumptions that governed camp operations for months. He ordered individual interviews with each prisoner to assess extent of linguistic capability. During interrogations, full scope became clear. These were not soldiers with limited phrasebook German. They spoke fluently with regional dialects and cultural knowledge. Some conversed in Hochdeutsch from formal education. Others demonstrated facility with Bavarian and Swabian variants. One prisoner spoke German with linguistic markers from pre-war Milwaukee that surprised his interrogator. German command faced immediate crisis. 3 months of operational discussions had occurred in presence of prisoners assumed not to comprehend. Security protocols had been based on linguistic separation that had never actually existed. Camp administration realized that evacuation plans, security procedures, and frank assessments of German military situation had all been understood by prisoners maintaining perfect concealment. Camp commander began reviewing what had been discussed within earshot of these prisoners. Conversations about forced march routes. Debates about expected casualty rates. Arguments between himself and regional command about surrender versus evacuation. Private expressions of doubt about war outcome. Personal discussions among guards about their fears and families. All of it had been comprehended by witnesses presumed deaf to German language. German officers debated response. Punishment for deception was standard protocol. However, acknowledging the security failure meant admitting that racial ideology had created exploitable blindness. Reporting situation to higher command meant explaining how this occurred under policies designed to ensure German superiority. The embarrassment was institutional rather than individual. Camp commander chose practical adaptation over ideological confrontation. He ordered immediate cessation of German conversations near any prisoners regardless of presumed language capability. He instructed guards to assume all prisoners understood German regardless of race or apparent background. He implemented new security protocols that eliminated reliance on linguistic separation. Critically, he did not report the full situation to regional command. His communications mentioned security adjustments without explaining the linguistic comprehension that necessitated them. This protected him from consequences of security failure while addressing immediate vulnerability. White American officers learned of the revelation simultaneously with German command. American captain demanded explanation for months of concealment. The bilingual prisoners explained their reasoning. Survival required any advantage available. Segregated conditions made solidarity with white officers uncertain. They had prioritized their own welfare when command structure had demonstrably prioritized them last. The revelation altered camp dynamics immediately. German guards became cautious in all prisoner presence. American command recognized intelligence capability they had never assessed or utilized. Both sides confronted evidence that their assumptions about these soldiers had been systematically wrong. The full consequences emerged only as evacuation timeline accelerated and theoretical plans became imminent reality. March 22, 1945. Soviet forces advanced to within 50 kilometers of Stalag 9B. German Regional Command issued evacuation order. The camp would be relocated via forced march covering 200 kilometers westward through deteriorating supply infrastructure. Timeline was immediate. Departure would occur regardless of prisoner physical condition. Camp commander received orders during early morning command meeting. Bilingual prisoners, now assigned to headquarters work details due to their linguistic capability, were present in adjacent office space. They heard entire planning discussion through open doors. They understood that march design prioritized prisoner control over prisoner survival. Guards received explicit instructions. Maintain pace regardless of individual prisoner capability. Prisoners unable to continue would be separated for medical collection, that all parties understood would never actually occur. Route avoided areas where American forces might intercept. It directed column through regions with minimal food sources and no shelter infrastructure. German command wanted prisoners alive for potential negotiation but needed them moved away from Soviet advance. Forced march served dual purpose: evacuation without direct execution, attrition through systematically lethal conditions. Medical support was deliberately minimal. Rest stops were planned in exposed areas. Supply allocation was calculated to sustain march pace, not prisoner welfare. Bilingual prisoners immediately grasped what white American officers did not yet understand. This was not routine evacuation but designed elimination event. Expected casualty rate of 30 to 40% was feature rather than failure of the plan. German command needed plausible deniability about intentional killing while achieving practical result of reduced prisoner population. American senior officers received official German notification through translated channels. Translation carefully obscured lethal intent behind administrative language about relocation and resource management. White officers understood they were evacuating but not why the specific route and timeline had been selected. Bilingual prisoners faced immediate decision. They possessed detailed knowledge of German planning obtained through overheard discussions. Revealing this intelligence meant explaining capability German command now knew but American officers did not. Time was critical. March was scheduled to begin in 48 hours. One prisoner requested urgent meeting with American senior captain. He explained in specific detail what German planning sessions had revealed. He provided route information, timeline, supply arrangements, and German casualty expectations. His knowledge was too detailed to attribute to speculation or rumor. American captain was initially skeptical. Information seemed impossibly precise. Prisoner explained linguistic capability that had been concealed for months. He offered real-time demonstration by translating current German guard conversations occurring in the hallway. Translation was accurate and immediate. Verification was undeniable. Confirmation led to strategic shift among American prisoners. They now understood forced march was survival challenge rather than administrative relocation. Senior American officers began organizing prisoner response. They evaluated options for resistance, negotiation, or delay. Bilingual soldiers continued translating ongoing German preparations, providing intelligence update as situations developed. The prisoners identified which German guards expressed discomfort with forced march plan. They recognized which officers had advocated internally for surrender rather than evacuation. They overheard arguments between camp commander and regional authority about whether orders should be followed despite obvious cost to prisoner lives. American captain made decision to approach camp commander directly. He revealed that prisoners understood forced march's true purpose through linguistic comprehension German command had only recently discovered. He proposed alternative. Camp commander could contact approaching American forces and negotiate direct surrender. Argument was pragmatic. Surrender to Americans protected German personnel from Soviet capture. It preserved prisoner lives and demonstrated Geneva Convention compliance. Regional command had ordered forced march, but camp commander had authority to assess when situation made those orders impossible to execute safely. Camp commander faced choice between following lethal orders and negotiating preservation. Soviet advance represented existential threat to German personnel. American forces represented potential prosecution but probable survival. Regional command expected obedience. Local conditions made obedience increasingly catastrophic. Bilingual prisoners provided real-time translation as commander contacted American forward units via radio. They heard his negotiation of surrender terms. They understood his arguments to his own officers about why this violated orders but ensured survival for all parties. They translated American responses being communicated through military channels. Critical decisions made by individuals operating outside official authority deserve documentation. If you value accounts of agency exercised under constraint, these testimonies preserve what institutions preferred not to record. March 24, American forward units arrived at Stalag 9B. Forced march was cancelled. Camp surrendered without resistance. Regional German command learned of decision after completion. Bilingual prisoners had provided intelligence that enabled negotiation pathway. Their revelation created alternative that saved prisoners across all categories and protected German personnel from Soviet capture. The test of whether linguistic capability could translate into changed outcomes succeeded. Consequences extended beyond immediate survival into weeks and months that followed. Camp Liberation occurred March 24, 1945. American forces documented conditions immediately upon arrival. Standard POW liberation protocol included prisoner testimony, facility inspection, and evidence collection for potential war crimes prosecution. The bilingual prisoners provided unusually detailed accounts because they could translate German camp records directly and explain German administrative decisions using original terminology. Their testimony included precise quotations of German conversations about discriminatory treatment. They described resource allocation decisions using exact German phrasing they had overheard. They explained security procedures as German guards had discussed them. Documentation was comprehensive because witnesses were also translators who had monitored camp operations for months. Reports reached U.S. Army Command within days. The linguistic capability attracted immediate attention from military intelligence. Questions emerged about classification procedures. How had German-speaking black soldiers been assigned to service units without language assessment? Why were these capabilities not documented in personnel records? What other linguistic expertise might be present but unidentified in military population? Investigation revealed systematic oversight in personnel evaluation. Many black soldiers from German-American communities possessed language skills that had never been formally tested. Segregated induction processing had categorized soldiers by race rather than capability. Military intelligence had assumed language expertise correlated with education, officer status, and racial identity. Black enlisted men were presumed to lack such expertise regardless of actual background. The revelation prompted review of POW treatment policies across theaters. Evidence of discriminatory ration allocation was documented with unusual precision because witnesses understood both German planning and its implementation. Red Cross received testimony that included verbatim German justifications for differential treatment as overheard and comprehended by bilingual prisoners. Several white American officers who had been senior personnel in camp faced questions about their conduct. Bilingual prisoners testified about conversations where American officers had accommodated or reinforced German discriminatory practices. Some had explicitly requested continued segregation to maintain discipline. Others had prioritized white prisoner welfare in resource negotiations. Testimony was specific because it included direct quotations from German discussions that these officers had participated in through translators. Post-war military analysis began examining broader implications. Researchers investigated how many other German-speaking black soldiers had been in POW camps throughout European theater. They assessed whether linguistic capabilities had affected survival rates in other facilities. They explored parallel cases in Pacific theater involving Japanese-speaking prisoners whose language skills might similarly have been unrecognized. Military began reassessing personnel classification methods. The case demonstrated costly inefficiency in race-based assignment systems. Language capability represented actionable intelligence advantage. Segregation had created vulnerability that could be exploited by adversaries. Integration advocates cited the case as evidence that racial hierarchies weakened rather than strengthened military effectiveness. Academic interest emerged in immediate post-war period. Linguists studied the bilingual prisoners' dialect preservation. Their German reflected pre-war American immigrant communities. Some spoke variants no longer common in post-war Germany. Historical documentation of immigrant linguistic communities was enhanced through their detailed testimony about language acquisition and community usage patterns. The prisoners themselves experienced complex aftermath. They had revealed capability that their own military had never assessed. They had provided intelligence that saved lives while operating outside official channels. Their testimony documented war crimes but simultaneously highlighted American segregation during war portrayed as moral crusade against Nazi racism. Reactions among the prisoners were mixed. Some felt vindicated that their capability had proven valuable despite systematic dismissal. Others felt bitter that recognition came only when white lives were at stake. Several noted irony that they had proven themselves to German captors and American officers simultaneously, yet institutional change remained minimal. German-American communities learned their story gradually through veteran networks and family correspondence. Families who had faced wartime suspicion about German cultural maintenance discovered that their language preservation had served Allied military objectives. Narrative was complicated. German heritage had enabled American military success against Germany itself. Some communities embraced story as redemption. Others remained uncomfortable with renewed attention to German linguistic capability. Stories that complicate rather than simplify historical memory deserve priority in preservation. If you seek documentation that reveals institutional failure alongside individual capability, these accounts matter. Media coverage was limited initially. Story didn't fit convenient post-war narratives about American heroism or organizational superiority. It revealed uncomfortable contradictions about segregation during war against racial ideology. Decades passed before fuller documentation emerged through academic research and veteran testimony projects. Historical record preserved incident but marginalized its implications about military efficiency, racial assumptions, and costs of segregated systems that rendered available expertise invisible and unutilized. German military conducted internal review after Stalag 9B surrender. Camp commanders' negotiated capitulation had violated explicit evacuation orders from regional authority. His superiors demanded explanation for insubordination during final weeks of war when discipline was considered essential to maintaining organized resistance. Commander cited intelligence failure as justification. He reported that prisoners had possessed linguistic comprehension that compromised security protocols. His defense argued that 3 months of operational discussions had been understood by prisoners whose capability contradicted all classification assumptions. Evacuation plans had been compromised before implementation became possible. Regional Command investigated how such security breach occurred. They reviewed camp assignment procedures for Black American prisoners. Records showed these prisoners had been classified as minimal intelligence threats based on race and service unit designation. Classification assumed linguistic superiority belonged to German personnel. Guards had been trained that language provided inherent security advantage. Review concluded that ideological assumptions had created systematic vulnerability. Nazi racial theory insisted Black soldiers were inferior and uneducated. This assumption governed camp operations and security protocols. Possibility that Black prisoners might speak fluent German was ideologically impossible. Guards operated under training that made such capability literally unthinkable. The failure was structural rather than individual. Camp commander had followed standard procedures. Guards had adhered to established protocols. Security measures were designed around racial hierarchy that proved false. German post-war documentation minimized the incident in official reports. Surrender was attributed to inevitable military circumstances and overwhelming Allied advance. Reports did not emphasize intelligence failure rooted in racial ideology that had been foundational to Nazi governance. Some German officers privately acknowledged implications in post-war writings. One memoir described encountering prisoners who responded in flawless German and his inability to reconcile observation with ideological training. He reflected that racial doctrine had created blindness to observable reality. Another officer noted during Allied interrogation that similar assumptions might have compromised security throughout war with various prisoner populations. These reflections remained marginal to official German post-war narratives. Institutional preference was to attribute defeat to material factors rather than ideological failures. Acknowledging that racial assumptions created exploitable vulnerabilities contradicted narratives about German organizational superiority and military professionalism. American military response was bureaucratically complicated. Initial reports praised bilingual prisoners for valuable intelligence gathering under difficult circumstances. Subsequent reviews questioned why language capabilities remained unknown to military personnel systems throughout soldier service. How had comprehensive linguistic assessment been omitted from induction procedures? Investigation revealed segregated processing had not included language evaluation for Black soldiers. Assumption was that language expertise existed primarily in officer and specialist classifications. Black soldiers were automatically routed to service roles without capability assessment. Policy had rendered expertise invisible regardless of whether it existed. Military had systematically failed to identify available resources. Military intelligence began comprehensive review of personnel classification procedures. They identified hundreds of soldiers with unreported language capabilities across multiple languages. Many possessed skills in German, Italian, French, and Japanese from family backgrounds and immigrant communities. Segregated assignment system had made this expertise unutilized and undocumented. Post-war policy recommendations included universal language assessment regardless of race or anticipated assignment. Language skills should factor into personnel decisions. Capabilities should be formally documented. Recommendations were detailed and well-reasoned. Implementation was slow and incomplete. Institutional momentum favored existing structures over comprehensive reform. American senior officers who had been prisoners at Stalag 9B faced unofficial scrutiny. Some had been explicitly criticized in bilingual prisoners' testimony for accommodating German discriminatory practices. Their conduct was documented in war crimes investigations and Red Cross reports. Military chose not to pursue formal charges. War was ending. Institutional priority was unity rather than accountability. Informal consequences were significant for some careers. Several officers received postings that sidelined them from advancement tracks. Others found wartime conduct mentioned in efficiency reports that affected promotion decisions. None faced court-martial or public accountability. System protected itself by treating documented failures as individual shortcomings rather than structural problems. The case highlighted contradictions military preferred not to examine publicly. Black soldiers had demonstrated expertise that saved white lives while experiencing systematic discrimination. They had operated outside official intelligence channels because segregation excluded them from such roles. They had proven capable precisely where ideology insisted capability could not exist. Integration debates in post-war military used the case selectively. Integrationists cited it as evidence that segregation wasted available talent and weakened military effectiveness. Segregationists argued that exceptional cases proved general rules rather than challenged them. Both extracted preferred meanings from same events without addressing underlying assumptions about capability and race. Academic and historical communities' initial response was fragmented. Story appeared in scattered veteran accounts and specialized POW studies. It did not feature prominently in standard World War II narratives. Reasons for marginalization were multiple and reinforcing. Story didn't conform to heroic templates that dominated post-war memory. It highlighted American racism during war portrayed as moral crusade against Nazi racial ideology. It revealed military inefficiency during periods celebrating American organizational superiority. It complicated narratives about linguistic hierarchies and cultural expertise. Several bilingual prisoners attempted public documentation of their experience. One wrote to military historians offering detailed testimony. Letters received polite acknowledgement without substantive follow-up. Another provided interview to regional newspaper. Article ran once without broader dissemination. Story existed in fragments across disconnected sources rather than coherent historical narrative. German-American communities had divided reactions. Some families took pride that cultural maintenance had served American military objectives. Others preferred silence because German heritage remained sensitive in post-war environment. Linguistic capability that had saved lives could also attract suspicion about loyalty. Communities navigated complex relationship between ethnic identity and national allegiance. Irony was noted by prisoners themselves in later testimonies. They had spoken German learned in American neighborhoods from families who had immigrated generations earlier. They had preserved immigrant linguistic traditions during period when such preservation faced systematic pressure to assimilate. They had used this preservation to counter ideology of regime that had created conditions causing German immigration to America in previous century. Post-war documentation accumulated slowly through veteran organizations and oral history projects. Some prisoners participated in testimony collection decades after events. Accounts were archived but not prominently featured in mainstream historical works. Full story remained dispersed across incomplete sources until later historians recognized significance for understanding intersection of race, language, military efficiency, and institutional assumptions about capability. The bilingual prisoners returned to United States in spring 1945 through standard demobilization processing. Their POW experience was documented in routine debriefing. Linguistic capability was noted in files but not emphasized in official records. They received no special commendations for intelligence provided. Military documentation reflected standard service completion without distinction. Most returned to communities where they had learned German. Milwaukee, St. Louis, Cincinnati, and other cities with German-American populations. They found neighborhoods changed by war. German language use had declined sharply due to wartime suspicion of German cultural maintenance. Churches that had conducted services in German now operated exclusively in English. Linguistic communities that had created their capability were disappearing. Several attempted to resume pre-war employment. One returned to family business that had struggled during his absence. Another found his factory position had been eliminated. Several enrolled in college using GI Bill benefits. They encountered segregation at home similar to what they had experienced in military service. German language capability that had saved lives in camp had limited economic value in peacetime America. Some became teachers, utilizing bilingual capability in educational contexts. Others worked as translators during post-war reconstruction efforts in occupied Germany. A few found positions in military intelligence, though typically below their demonstrated capability level. Recognition as experts came only after proving competence under extreme circumstances rather than through formal assessment. Family relationships were complicated for some. Explaining POW experience required discussing conditions and discriminatory treatment. Describing linguistic revelation meant acknowledging months of strategic deception. Families struggled to understand why capability wasn't revealed immediately. Strategic calculations that ensured survival were difficult to explain to those who hadn't faced those circumstances. Several prisoners maintained contact through informal networks. They shared understanding that others couldn't fully grasp. Annual reunions provided space to discuss experience without requiring explanation to outsiders. Gatherings were private rather than publicized. Bond was forged in circumstances they found difficult to articulate to those who hadn't witnessed them. White American soldiers saved by negotiated surrender rarely acknowledged role bilingual prisoners played. Some remained unaware of how intelligence enabled their survival. Others knew but didn't publicly credit black soldiers' contribution. Post-war narratives focused on liberation rather than intelligence that prevented forced march casualties. German camp commander faced war crimes investigation. Testimony from prisoners, including bilingual soldiers, was mixed. They described discriminatory treatment alongside his decision to surrender rather than execute lethal evacuation orders. He received minimal sentence, served partial term, was released in early 1950s. Complexity of his actions resisted simple moral categorization. Recognition came slowly and incompletely. Military historians mentioned incident in footnotes of specialized works. Veteran organizations eventually collected testimonies. No medals or official commendations were awarded for intelligence contribution. Story remained marginal to standard World War II historiography. By 1990s, academic interest increased among researchers examining segregated military experience. Case illustrated both discrimination and capability. It demonstrated operational costs of segregation in measurable terms. Some bilingual prisoners participated in oral history projects. They were elderly by then. Many had already died. Those who spoke expressed mixture of pride and frustration. Pride in accomplishment under impossible circumstances. Frustration that recognition came late and incompletely. Several expressed satisfaction that they had saved lives regardless of formal recognition. Others acknowledged bitterness about decades of institutional neglect of their story. Most accepted that history remembers institutions more readily than individuals. Families preserved documents, letters, and photographs. Materials eventually reached archives where researchers used them to reconstruct fuller narrative. Documentary evidence validated claims that had been dismissed as exceptional or improbable. Legacy exists in fragments rather than monuments. No major memorial commemorates their contribution. Names appear in specialized historical works. Story is taught in some military history courses. They represent intersection of race, language, and military operations that standard narratives typically miss. The story reveals fundamental truths about institutional perception and capability recognition. Capability exists independent of institutional acknowledgement. Systems designed around assumptions about who possesses expertise miss contradicting evidence. Bilingual prisoners possessed valuable skills before anyone validated them. Capability didn't require institutional recognition to be real. It required crisis to become visible to those who had systematically ignored it. Organizations create hierarchies of presumed competence. These hierarchies determine who gets assessed, who gets utilized, who gets recognized. When hierarchies correlate with identity categories, capability outside expected patterns becomes functionally invisible. Military assumed language expertise aligned with officer status, education level, and racial identity. Assumptions created vulnerability that adversaries could exploit. Enemy forces made mirror assumptions based on their own ideological hierarchies. Both sides were blind to reality that contradicted organizational logic. The prisoners exploited dual institutional blindness. Survival depended on capability neither side expected them to possess. Intelligence advantage existed only because institutions couldn't imagine their competence. Recognition required sacrificing strategic position. Revelation meant visibility, which threatened those who had been systematically blind. Choice to reveal was therefore choice between tactical advantage and moral obligation. They chose revelation when silence became indistinguishable from complicity. History contains thousands of similar calculations that went undocumented. Pattern is consistent across institutions and eras. Capability contradicting institutional assumptions gets ignored systematically. Crisis sometimes forces visibility. Visibility rarely produces systematic change in foundational assumptions. After crisis passes, institutions revert to comfortable hierarchies. Prisoners demonstrated expertise that should have transformed classification systems. Post-war military adjusted some procedures. Fundamental assumptions about correlation between identity and capability persisted largely unchanged. Story also reveals costs of ideological certainty. Nazi racial ideology made German forces blind to intelligence threat. American segregation policy made U.S. military unable to utilize available expertise. Both ideologies prioritized maintaining hierarchies over operational effectiveness. Both paid costs in military efficiency. Neither substantially reconsidered foundational assumptions even when costs became documented and undeniable. Individuals within systems often recognize contradictions that institutions refuse to acknowledge. German camp commanders saw ideology confronting impossible reality. American officers witnessed capability that segregation insisted couldn't exist. Individual recognition rarely translates to institutional change. Institutions have momentum that individual insight struggles to redirect effectively. Prisoners understood this dynamic clearly. They didn't expect revelation to transform systems fundamentally. They acted to save lives within existing systems rather than attempting to reform those systems. Pragmatism reflected understanding that survival precedes justice. This creates tension between immediate moral action and long-term systemic change. Choice they faced was not between right and wrong but between competing moral obligations. Protect themselves through concealment or reveal to protect others. Individual preservation versus collective welfare. They chose revelation knowing it offered no guarantee of recognition or reform. Moral weight came from accepting personal risk for uncertain collective benefit. History accumulates through such decisions. Most occur without documentation, recognition, or memorial. Absence of recognition doesn't diminish moral weight of choices made. It reveals what societies choose to remember versus what they prefer to forget. Stories that complicate convenient narratives face systematic marginalization. Final truth is procedural rather than heroic. Systems operate on assumptions about capability distribution. Assumptions create blindness to contradicting evidence. Blindness creates vulnerability. Crisis sometimes forces visibility. Visibility rarely produces systemic change. Cycle continues with different populations and different assumptions. The bilingual prisoners who spoke fluent German to their captors represent pattern rather than historical anomaly. Their story exists in tension between exceptional circumstances and common institutional dynamics. Exceptional was specific convergence. German-American communities, segregated military structure, Nazi racial ideology, POW camp context. Common was institutional blindness to capability contradicting organizational assumptions. History contains countless similar stories awaiting proper documentation. Individuals whose capabilities were invisible to institutions that should have identified them. People who made moral calculations under circumstances offering no purely good options. Decisions that saved lives without receiving validation or formal recognition. These stories resist simple heroic narratives preferred by popular memory. They involve compromises, calculations, and partial victories. They reveal institutional failures alongside individual agency. They demonstrate survival strategies rather than triumphant conclusions. Standard historical memory prefers cleaner narratives with clear heroes, definitive victories, recognition validating moral action, and progress following from sacrifice. Actual historical record is more complex and less emotionally satisfying. Capability exists unrecognized by those with power to utilize it. Moral action occurs without institutional validation. Institutions learn slowly when they learn at all. Recognition comes late, incompletely, or never arrives. Documenting these stories matters precisely because they complicate rather than confirm comfortable assumptions. They challenge presumptions about who possesses expertise and capability. They reveal costs of organizational hierarchies based on identity rather than assessment. They demonstrate how ideology creates operational vulnerability in measurable terms. They show individuals navigating systems that cannot see them accurately or completely. Bilingual prisoners made choices that history barely recorded. They survived circumstances designed to destroy them. They saved lives while experiencing systematic discrimination. They demonstrated capability contradicting two nations' racial ideologies simultaneously. They received minimal recognition for substantial contribution. Their story was marginalized because it exposed truths institutions preferred not to examine. Preserving such accounts requires recognizing that historical importance differs from popular appeal. Stories matter because they reveal truth, not because they confirm preferred beliefs. Historical documentation serves understanding rather than comfort. Past was more complex than memorials suggest. Individuals were more capable than institutions recognized. Survival required more calculation than heroism conventionally implies. This channel exists to document those complexities, to preserve accounts that standard narratives marginalize, to examine human decisions under circumstances offering no easy answers, to recognize capability that institutions failed to see, to validate experiences that official history overlooked. Subscribe to ensure these accounts remain accessible and documented. Share this story with those who value historical complexity over simplified memory. Support preservation of experiences that institutions preferred to forget. This is Battlefront Insider, where we reveal the human stories behind every war.